On July 9, 1962, the U.S. military detonated a nuclear weapon 250 miles above the Pacific Ocean, and nobody told the public what happened next. The Cold War wasn't just fought on the ground. By the early 1960s, both the United States and the Soviet Union had begun asking a terrifying question. Could nuclear weapons work in space, not just as delivery systems, but as actual strategic tools? The answer meant everything. Control space and you controlled the planet. So in the spring of 1962, the U.S. Air Force began planning something that would have seemed like science fiction just 5 years earlier. The operation had a code name, Starfish Prime, and it wasn't classified by accident. What the military wanted to test was whether a thermonuclear detonation in the upper atmosphere would disable enemy satellites and radar systems across an entire continent. They didn't know at that moment what they would actually break. May 1962. Johnston Island, a tiny atoll in the Central Pacific, became the launch pad. The Air Force had chosen it deliberately, far enough from population centers that fallout wouldn't be a political problem, close enough to the equator that scientists could study the effects across multiple latitudes. A Thor missile sat on the pad armed with a 1.4 megaton warhead. For comparison, the bomb dropped on Hiroshima was 0.015 megatons. This was roughly 100 times more powerful. The scientists and officers involved knew the basics of what would happen. A thermonuclear explosion at that altitude would create an electromagnetic pulse, an EMP, that could fry electronics across thousands of miles. But they didn't know the true scale. They didn't know what else would happen in the seconds and minutes after ignition. July 9, 1962, 11:00 a.m. local time. The Thor lifted off. It climbed in a perfect arc, its trajectory calculated to reach exactly 250 miles up, high enough to be in near space, low enough to maximize atmospheric interaction. The warhead was set to detonate at the precise moment of apogee. Everything that followed would be recorded by instruments, satellites, and ground stations across the Pacific. 9 minutes after launch, the warhead detonated. The flash was visible from Hawaii over 700 miles away. It turned night into day, but what made Starfish Prime truly significant wasn't the light show, it was what happened to the sky itself. The explosion created something called an artificial radiation belt. Electrons from the upper atmosphere were energized by the blast and trapped in Earth's magnetic field. They formed a glowing shell of radiation that persisted for months. People across the Pacific reported seeing strange auroras, curtains of light in colors they'd never seen before. But these weren't the natural northern lights. They were the death glow of a weapon test. Within hours, the consequences became clear. Streetlights in Honolulu flickered. Telephone systems across the Pacific experienced interference. But the real damage was invisible. Satellites, including military reconnaissance craft that the U.S. depended on, began failing. Some died immediately. Others degraded over weeks as the radiation slowly destroyed their electronics. The military had created a weapon that wounded its own infrastructure. By the time the public learned what had happened, the test was already over. The military released minimal information. Most Americans never knew that their own government had just detonated a nuclear weapon in the sky above them. The news coverage was sparse, buried, quickly forgotten. The Cold War demanded secrecy, and secrecy won. But the scientific community understood the magnitude. Starfish Prime had proven that nuclear weapons in space were far more destructive than anyone had anticipated, not just to enemy targets, but to the entire technological ecosystem that modern warfare depended on. It was a Pyrrhic victory. You could win the war and lose the infrastructure that won it. The test also had an unintended consequence that would echo through decades of diplomacy. The Soviet Union watched. They saw what the Americans had done, and within months they conducted their own high-altitude nuclear test, creating their own artificial radiation belt. The arms race didn't just extend into space, it contaminated it. The radiation belts created by both tests persisted in Earth's magnetosphere for years. Satellites had to be hardened against radiation. Astronauts had to be briefed on the new hazards of near space. The Van Allen belts, Earth's natural radiation zones, now had artificial companions, a scar written in high-energy particles that space explorers still have to navigate around today. Starfish Prime was declassified in 1995. Decades after the test, the public finally learned the full story. And when they did, the reaction was immediate: shock, anger, and a strange sense of violation. Your own government had tested a nuclear weapon in the sky above you and you weren't told. The secrecy, once justified by Cold War logic, now seemed like a betrayal of trust. Today, Starfish Prime stands as a cautionary tale. It reminds us that weapons tested in secret can have consequences far beyond their intended targets. It shows us the fragility of the technological systems we depend on. And it demonstrates something darker, that during the Cold War, governments were willing to experiment on their own skies, their own populations, without consent or transparency. The radiation belts eventually faded, the satellites were replaced, life moved on, but the legacy of Starfish Prime didn't disappear. It became a boundary marker, a moment when humanity realized that space wasn't infinite, that it could be wounded, that weapons could leave scars in the very fabric of our planet's protective magnetosphere. The test files are open now, the photographs exist, the data has been analyzed and reanalyzed by generations of scientists. But the real story, the one about secrecy, about Cold War logic pushing past the boundaries of reason, about what happens when nations treat the sky as a weapons range, that story is what matters most. Starfish Prime wasn't just a weapons test. It was a moment when humanity's reach finally exceeded its wisdom. And in the glow of that artificial aurora, reflected in the eyes of people who didn't know what they were seeing, the Cold War showed its true cost. Subscribe for more untold stories from the hidden chapters of space exploration, the ones that rewrote what we thought was possible.